from the heart of the Great Southwest, this is KALP-FM Alpine.
Marfa came into being only after 1883, when the Chihuahua Trail, coming up out of Mexico and going to Fort Davis, was bisected by the railroad. It created an area that made a logical town.
We still have just about the same number of people living here, between 2,500 and 3,000. When I first came out here, there were a lot of old, established ranch families, and the community actually has been in a depressed state for quite a while.
43 years ago, we had 2 banks and grocery stores and a Safeway and all kinds of convenience, you know, here. But we don't have it anymore. You can't shop here. There ain't no place.
If you can think of a small West Texas town, the last thing you would imagine is someone coming from New York and putting in modern art on a large scale. And I think that continues to amaze people, probably not just here.
It just seems strange to me. Anybody would land in a little old cow town. We don't grow nothing but grass. You know, if you don't have a cow, how you gonna live? You know, we just raise cattle, horses, and that's it.
It's not surprising that the residents of Marfa should raise an eyebrow at the prospect of this dying West Texas town becoming a world-famous centre for ultra-sophisticated modern art. But the town's unlikely rebirth has been underway for many years now, ever since the sculptor Donald Judd moved here in the early 70s. One of the pioneers of the minimalist movement, Judd died last February. In the 20 years he spent in Marfa, he acquired a staggering amount of buildings and land in the town and its surrounding areas. This is a film about how one of the art world's biggest and most reclusive figures came to take over a small town in Texas.
The first time I saw him, I had a house that I wanted to sell, and he brought his mother and father up to look at that house. And we showed him around, and he didn't have a whole lot to say, which he never did have, actually. And after he left, I told my wife, I said, well, that middle-aged hippie that can't have the money to buy this house, he can't buy this house. So we can forget that.
When he came here, I think he visualized pretty well what he had in mind to do and to accomplish in Marfa, that he could place the art that he had in this area, and still the area would retain its rustic quality. He was not defacing anything in nature. He found buildings here at Old Fort Russell that he felt would fit, his art would fit in. And everything that he did, I think, was a well-laid plan. Am I not right in saying that Don Judd is an enigma in the art world? They don't understand Don Judd. They don't understand his art. I'm not an artist, not in any sense of the word. When you get beyond Norman Rockwell and things that I can relate to. So this is a radical departure from the art that we're used to. And in my mind, that is one of the greatest misunderstandings that Don had to live under in this area. Nobody understood his art.
I heard 2 ladies who came out, and I heard one of them say, well, this is minimalistic. And I didn't know what that was. So in my mind, it was cubes. So I asked someone, is it cubist? It's cubist. Well, they didn't have a yes or a no, or maybe. And I still don't know, except that it's a no-frills thing.
Judd's no-frills aesthetic made its first appearance not in his pared-down sculptures, but in his writings as a jobbing art critic. In the rapidly expanding New York art world of the 1950s and early 60s, his reviews and articles were well known. Hired and subsequently fired from a range of art magazines, his blunt prose style earned him a reputation as an art world Ernest Hemingway, and his harsh judgments as a formidable, even frightening voice.
Don Judd turned up at the office of Arts magazine one day and asked if he could review exhibitions for us, and we read over the reviews he had written for Art News, and we found them quite striking. They were admittedly unlike other critics' reviews at the time. They were forthright, almost to a fault, but very fresh, written in this sort of stark, as we might now say, minimalist prose, very unembellished, sort of anti-rhetorical. And we found them rather refreshing.
I think that he was a very, very clear voice in the art world, although a little uncompromising and in some instances not generous, but it was obvious that he was trying to stake out his own territory in the writing. It's clear that he was making a path for his own work to emerge. If you read the subtext of his writing, the subtext of his writing is what art ought to be and what it ought not to be, and therefore his work arrives about what it ought to be. It's very clever.
I don't think anyone, certainly least of all myself, could have imagined that this very stark, clipped, somewhat authoritarian style of criticism would very shortly be translated into an art movement that wielded tremendous influence and that won important acolytes. In Judd's case, he really did become a kind of chef d'école, or the head of a movement. As I recall, almost the only other artist in the movement who he extravagantly admired was Dan Flavin.
It was 1962, and I went to his place on Park Avenue South, and I saw what he was up to, and it estranged most people. And I guess to a certain extent it put me out also, but I liked him, and I liked it. At that point he was up to making physical paintings, the ones with modeled surfaces, and had insets in the front of the paintings. There was nothing like it around. Nothing like it.
From these early paintings, Judd developed his first three-dimensional works. Initially handmade, using wood and metal, and hand-painted, using only one single colour, cadmium red light, the sculptures gradually became more refined, sharper, simpler, apparently emptier. Gradually, the focus of the work became the ability of one strikingly simple object to define and articulate the space around it. By the mid-60s, a whole movement had grown up around this look. Although Judd himself never used the term, minimalism was the label that stuck. Minimalism changed the way people thought about art. Its uncompromising industrial appearance, it was literally made to order by workers in factories using industrial materials, made all other art seem somehow archaic.
The first particular job we did was lining one of his wooden boxes, or covering the outside with metal. That was in, I think, March or April of 1964. After that, he said, hey, that was such a good job that he switched over and let us do it without him making the wood. And from there on in, we've been doing it for the last 30 years until his demise. He was a tough baby. He knew what he wanted, and he made sure he got it. And I remember we had made this box, and he had called in that he wanted a 2 1/4 inch, the top down 2 1/4 inches. And then he called back the next day, I hope you didn't do it yet. Why, Don? What's wrong? He says, I want it 2 5/16. That's only like a centimeter more, but to him that meant a lot.
Judd wanted tight control not only over every detail of the appearance and the making of his art, but also over how it was shown. The problems of how museums and galleries display art had been the subject of some of his most bitter writings, and as his work got bigger, so did his ambitions for housing it.
He was always waiting to be given space to work with, and as he got to need bigger and bigger space, he would say, well, he would be wanting to be invited to fill this whole gallery. And they'd say, well, no, we only have a small gallery because we have an exhibit of Impressionism in the other wing. And he would want the wing, It's that, my work needs the space, man, give it to me.
By the late 1960s, minimalism was the dominant form. Judd's work was bought by major museums and big collectors worldwide, and as his success and wealth grew, he began looking around for a big space where work by himself and artists he admired could be displayed to its best advantage. He found it in the New York art scene's most newly fashionable district, Soho.
Judd bought this building, 101 Spring Street in New York, in 1968. Built in 1870, it still retains many of the original features, these huge windows, for example. But Judd had new floors, walls and ceilings put in, and eventually it became his home, studio and showing space. It used to be a factory with a different business on each of the 5 floors. You can still see the oil from the old machinery coming through parts of the ceiling. This building was the beginning of Judd's experiments with controlling and organising living space. Each floor has a clearly separate function: a studio, a dining room, a formal meeting place, and up here on the 5th floor, a bedroom. But there's art everywhere, art by Judd and by other artists he admired, and it's shown in exactly the way that Judd thought it ought to be shown. A 70-foot-long light installation by Dan Flavin, for example, was made especially for this space.
Does seem like a museum, but that's an extension of his studio, and I liked it. I'm a messier person, but I had to. I was the wife, but I liked that space. I liked a lot of space. As you can see, I like a lot of space. This is my studio now, but at that time, the beauty of certain objects set off by a lot of space seemed like the way to live. It still seems like a beautiful thing to have.
The space in the Spring Street building seemed luxurious at first, but Judd soon grew out of it and became restless for something even bigger.
Don started to feel that he did not get true attention from people as he became better known. It stayed the same, and he was very disillusioned. He was having problems getting the support from his gallery, and he wanted to have more space, bigger space. He wanted to have more say in having big pieces that he could build and look at. And personally, he felt hemmed in by the economics of the situation, and he loved the desert, and he loved the space out there, and he liked emptiness.
Being from Missouri, he loved the farms, and he really liked the simplicity of the farm life. But of course, there's no art world in Missouri, and if you're serious about being an artist, you have to go to New York. And he's explained numerous times that he hated New York, and the only reason he went there is because that's where the art world was and you just had to be there. But he never liked it and was very intent on finding a real place to live, where he could work and where he could kind of expand his ambitions architecturally. He was successful enough that people would call him wherever he was. So as soon as he had the freedom to do that, he took advantage of it. So we commenced to do a lot of traveling around in Arizona, California, New Mexico, and Texas. And Marfa was basically a number of things. The land was very nice, and the town is very nice, the people are nice, and the town wasn't very built up. And if you look on the map of the United States, it's about as far away from a major city as you can get in the U.S. So it fit all the criteria, and houses were cheap and everything. And he finally bought this building in '74.
When he first came out here, I guess the first real property he bought was a couple of these big buildings over on the highway, storage buildings, where he later had his compound where he lived in this two-story building, and started putting up his adobe wall around that compound. And it was different for people out here. They weren't used to that sort of thing, and most of them I don't guess have ever gotten used to it. But you can't blame the local people too much on that. They didn't have any architectural or art appreciation background, so really you can't blame them for not understanding what he was doing.
What he was doing with this compound, which came to be known as the Block, was an expanded version of his Spring Street building in New York. As well as making his home here, he carefully placed within these huge spaces his own work from the 60s and 70s. If his sculpture was designed to relate to the space around it, here there was space in abundance with no distractions. Now work that had previously been considered too large and difficult even for museums could finally be built and shown. Here in Marfa, he began to experiment with architecture and furniture design. He made dining areas, benches, a barbecue, all in the characteristic robust, functional Judd style. Even the traditional adobe wall with which he surrounded the compound became part of his work. But it was the wall more than anything else that came to symbolise the artist for many of Marfa's residents.
That caused a lot of mysterious thinking about him, or thinking that he was mysterious. That things might be going on behind the wall. What would you think about a tall wall you couldn't see through or over? Yeah, what was it about? It was a mystery. I think he still remains a mystery.
Anytime you get anywhere and build something between you and the rest of the world, in a way that tells people, I don't want to be a part of you. It was as if I just don't want to hobnob with you people out there.
He wouldn't drink coffee with us, or he didn't come in the restaurant. He didn't associate with anybody that I know of. You know, he's a loner.
He was accused of being a devil worshiper, and Don Judd was not a devil worshiper. You know what he was doing back in this compound? He was listening to his favorite music around campfires, bagpipes. And our Mexican-American people are, by very nature, suspicious people. And these youngsters would peek through the cracks in the gates and see Don in there and wonder what was going on. He was not a devil worshiper. And I think I know him well enough to say that without reservation.
Judd did cause some major rows in the Marfa community. For some time he was at war with Happy Godbold, the owner of a thriving feed mill. The noise from Godbold's plant irritated Judd, and he had signs put up instructing truck drivers to turn off engines and keep noise levels down. But he'd known the plant was there when he bought the block, and his actions now seemed like arrogance, serving only to alienate him still further from much of the community.
He got mad at the community over the noise.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Don bought the block, and it's sandwiched between the highway and a railroad and a feed mill and an ice plant.
So it was his fault to an extent.
Well, not his fault, but where he decided to buy
it was not
problematic.
It was a noisy place.
It had railroad on the right and highway, feed mill, ice plant.
People here saw that as he bought up buildings and bought up areas of the town, even though they were in the main unoccupied, they were a little bit leery or wondered just what is this guy up to? What are his intentions? Does he intend in making this the art capital of the world? Is he going to crowd us out?
Since the town is so small, if you own 4 buildings, that's a big majority. And he bought, I don't know how many buildings, I can't think of right off my head, and plus some old houses. So when you put them all together, and people started saying it's Juddville.
This is one of the first buildings Donald Judd bought in Marfa. Formerly a bank, it stands on the corner of the town's main street and is one of 5 buildings he eventually acquired on the street. As well as the bank, where he housed a permanent installation of his work and ran an office, there are 2 former hotels with more installations and offices and a print studio, a former grocery store with more installations, and a former apartment block which he used as a design studio for his furniture and architecture plans.
Marfa was full of empty buildings that nobody was using. And while he went ahead and bought them, he didn't take advantage of the persons he bought from, because he paid very good money for buildings.
Yeah, it's been said some people took advantage of him when they found out that Donald Judd was interested.
Oh, it's
the price
done.
went up.
Yeah, let's raise the price.
A lot of these buildings had closed up and were just sitting vacant and about to fall down. And he came in and bought these buildings and had a pretty good crew working. He kept a lot of people on the payroll. And instead of the buildings just sitting there vacant and getting in disrepair, he kept them up. And I think he's been great for the community.
He saw the aesthetic in the building and restored it. Where people had covered it with tacky plywood and stuff, he removed it and found the beauty of the building that was buried inside.
I have not been in the building since the bank moved to its new building in February of 1984. Well, it's totally different. When I was 18 years old, I came to work in this room as a mail clerk and then as an accounting individual for the bank. And this room used to have large machines in it and filing cabinets and things that we could work with the bank. So it's kind of neat to come in and see this room. It's very restful. I can hear in my imagination the sound of the machines working. I'm glad that he has preserved some of these buildings. I'd hate to have seen them torn down and new ones put in their places. It's nice to see it back. I always like these colors, these kind of neutral colors. And when they remodeled it in 1969, it was this horrendous avocado green that was so popular back in the late 60s. And so it's nice to see it back to the colors. It's also nice to see the mural. Again, when they remodeled in 69, they lowered the ceiling so that they could heat it better, because they always had a problem heating this building. And they lowered the ceiling and covered up the mural. So it's good to see it again.
The bank and other buildings in the street remained Judd's private property, places where he could study and work and place his art. But he also envisaged a public dimension to his work in Marfa, the creation of a museum and an art foundation. This project began with the conversion of an old wool plant into a home for 27 large sculptures by Judd's friend, John Chamberlain. This was how Judd thought art should be seen, a substantial group of pieces by a single artist on permanent display, shown simply but in strength. Then in 1979, he acquired Fort D.A. Russell, a former army base on the outskirts of town that had once been a prisoner of war camp. Murals by the inmates have been respectfully preserved by Judd. He established a charitable trust, the Chinati Foundation, named after a surrounding mountain range, which would bring artists of world renown to Marfa to create permanent installations for public view. Among them the pop artist Klaus Oldenburg and the Russian installation artist Ilya Kabakov. But the centrepiece of the Chinati Foundation was Judd's conversion of 2 former artillery sheds, which would house the artist's biggest and most ambitious project to date.
Judd completely redesigned these buildings with new walls, new roofs and new windows, allowing for massive views of the Texas landscape outside. At the same time, he designed the art that he was going to put inside the buildings. 100 anodized aluminium boxes, every one exactly the same size, 6 foot by 4 foot, but each one slightly different in its detail. There might be an open top or a closed top. There might be a diagonal plane within the box, or a simple bisection across, or a shelf formation or a corridor formation, but with each box picking up and reflecting the light in a different way.
It takes a while to understand what this was all about, but I kept an open mind about it, and it is on such a grand scale that it took me a while to snap to what was going on. Once I figured out what was going on, it's pretty incredible.
After going through the gun sheds and seeing his aluminum cubes, I finally decided he was a genius. But I had to have someone take me and show me and talk to me about that. And I wish everyone could have had that experience. Once a year, he had a lovely party, invited everybody.
Lots of food, lots of beverages, lots of people from all over the world, people from the surrounding towns. I'm trying to remember, well, yes, the bagpipers were there. They were in the arena, which was used for cutting horse shows. It's a large place with gravel on part of the floor and a large area outside with some tables. And there was always a bonfire that was meticulously built by someone. and the bagpiper marched around it late in the evening playing the pipes, and it was something. In a West Texas October evening with a clear sky, it was something to behold.
He did this sort of thing for the community that he felt that the community should appreciate, I think, more than he felt they did. There were disputes because of his having bought up all this country, all the buildings. He bought up a sizable fortune of land, inland. And although it has very little value, the amount of acres that he bought is a fortune by anybody's concept of a fortune. And he took it out of production. That was the big thing. They didn't run any livestock on it. He always referred to this area and the people in it, or the terrain, as the land. And that was almost like more than a sentence, more than a paragraph. It was the way he thought of this whole area. And it was, I think, a feeling of respect.
Every weekend we would go to the ranch because that's the real place to be. And if he was allowed to and had the time, he would have stayed at the ranch as much, for months. But I think, the limit was 2 or 3 weeks. Otherwise, things get unraveled. The total ranch is 34,000 acres, and this is the more recent and the larger part. It was bought in about '89. A lot of work was done on the house, and the design of the corral was cleaned up. And it was basically simply a place to go to rest and get away and to be quiet and to work, because if you don't have quiet, you can't work. To begin with, it doesn't have any electricity. And it does have a telephone, but nobody knows the number. So instead of making it comfortable like you're used to back in the city, you stay here and you experience it, and you mold yourself to it instead of the other way around. As he stayed here, the ideas came. So the studio was originally a barn, but it's more useful, obviously, as a studio. And, there was an idea of putting a library out here, just because, as this is the quietest place, it makes sense to put your books where you can read them. So there are lots of ideas, and there's obviously more ideas than time or money would allow.
Donald Judd's grand plans for the land and buildings he owned in and around Marfa came to a halt late in 1993 when he became ill and was diagnosed as suffering from lymphoma. He died on February the 12th, 1994, aged 65, and was buried on his ranch, his grave unmarked except for a single piece of funeral tartan.
We just knew this was his favorite place on the planet, and there was already a man who had worked here, buried here, so we knew it wouldn't be a problem, and it just seemed natural.
I think it marked the end of a particular generation. I think other people in that generation have gone on and done better or less work, but I think Judd kind of closed the chapter on minimalism. And I think it was sad, and I think everybody realized that we all got a day older the day he died.
Well, America had lost its greatest artist ever. That's an understanding, and I say that every time I'm asked. I always said it out whenever I was around him, so he knew what I thought. He's unique in American art history. There isn't anybody else as great as he, as incontestably great. I mean, he's just what he is. What he did was make a super establishment, which was to channel interest to his work at its best, and I think he probably succeeded. But I think he would have been considered great without Marfa. Marfa was an example of his misanthropic attitude around art. You make it extremely hard to get to, and the pilgrims are on their hands and knees.
When he died, a lot of people were sad. I think he died before his time. He had so many ideas and projects that he didn't finish. And I think a lot more people in Marfa had accepted him than when we first arrived.
On his own terms.
Yes.
Like I said earlier, he was shy, and you had to meet him if you wanted to. And he was too busy to mess with anything else. His work, his life, and his work was all-consuming.
He's gone. And I think people in town feel really sorry. One, I think the continuity of what he was trying to do, I'd hate to see stopped. I understand in his will he said, don't even move my house slippers. And I think, oh, I hope they don't.
Several years ago, I told somebody after he came in here and started working, I said, well, I hope that he'll make a art colony out of this town. And I hope that it will eventually develop into that, because you get artists coming in here, get enough of them, and tourists. I think that's really our only salvation, because we're not going to boom.